Hiya, today I'm going to talk about the exposure triangle. Now, many years ago when I first started with wildlife photography, I used to look at people's images and they'd put all the information of the settings that they used on that particular shot. So it might be f8, it might be a shutter speed of 2000th of a second with an ISO of 800, and then you'd look at another image and it'd be completely different settings. And you could look at 100 images and they'd be all different settings. Now, am I supposed to remember all of those settings for that particular shot, in that particular light, in that particular circumstances? And it used to really annoy me because I think, well, there's no way I'm going to remember all those. Well, the good news is you don't have to. I've learnt all about what you need to do. I'm going to share that with you today. Okay, well, the exposure triangle, that consists of 3 points. And those 3 points are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Now, first of all, the aperture. This is known as the f-stop. The f-stop is the amount of light that goes through the lens to the back of the camera onto something called the sensor. Now, the aperture is literally a hole in the lens that you can control, make bigger, or you can make smaller. And that's done by what we call f-stops. So, the lower the number, the bigger the aperture, the more light is let into the lens, going to the back of the camera onto the sensor. So that's what the aperture is. Next is the shutter speed. Well, term the shutter speed like a door that opens and closes in front of the sensor. Now the sensor, the back of the camera, that replaced the film that used to be in the cameras. So if you think about it like a door, the shutter opens and closes and allows the light through. Now, the faster that shutter opens and closes is how you freeze frame a subject. So if there's not a lot of light about, you have to go for a slower shutter speed. If there's plenty of light about and your subject is moving quickly, you want a quick shutter speed. So that's the shutter speed. And next is the ISO. Now the ISO controls the sensor at the back of the camera that has replaced the film. We're now digital and it's electronic, and because the sensor is electronic, we can turn its sensitivity up and down like a dimmer switch on a light. So you can actually it'll start off at 100 ISO and it will go up in increments of 100, 200, 400, 800. It could go up with my camera, it will go up from 100 to 125 to 160, 200, and it'll go up in different increments depending on the camera. But the ISO is something that you can control to allow the sensitivity to be higher, so that if you've not got the light that you need to get a good shutter speed, you can actually increase the ISO and that will allow more light onto the sensor, but it comes at a cost, because what happens is in the dark areas of an image, if you've gone quite high with your ISO, it introduces something called noise. Now noise is like a grainy effect in the dark areas and it can spoil the photo. In a lot of cases, if you've not gone too high, you'll see some noise, but in post-processing you can actually remove that noise. In other cases, you'll get noise around the subject, but the subject itself won't have any of this noise on it. So this is something that you have to try and test and try and test. It really depends on what light you're dealing with and where the subject is. If the subject's quite close, you can put the ISO right high to be able to freeze that action. So that is the exposure triangle. aperture, shutter speed, ISO. So how do we control the aperture, the shutter speed and the ISO? Well, this then depends on the modes of your camera. Those three modes are manual mode, which is M, aperture priority, which is AV, aperture value, or on some cameras A for aperture, and then there's TV, which is time value, or S, which is shutter speed. So those are the three modes that we're going to be looking at, and we need to be able to create and control the exposure triangle. Now with manual mode, you control the aperture, the shutter speed and the ISO. So in manual mode you control all three. But this is wildlife photography, and you've got to act quick. You don't know if that bird's going to come down in front of you. You don't know. You look round, there's a subject there, you need to get on it quick. So what we do with wildlife photography, which is something I personally do, is I let the camera help me. The camera assists what I'm doing. So what I do is I have my camera in setting AV. That's aperture value, which is aperture priority, which means I can prioritize the aperture and I'll tell it what I need it to be. So let's, for example, we'll put f5.6. So that's the aperture of f5.6. The ISO I might set at 400. Now, when I half press the shutter, the camera then will decide at that point what shutter speed it can gain from the light that's going onto the sensor via the lens through the aperture, controlled by the ISO for the sensitivity of the light. 250th of a second is good for a stationary subject, but let's say, for example, the camera's telling me 250th of a second and I want it to be 500th of a second. What I've got to do there is I've got to get more light onto that sensor, and there's only two ways that can happen. I can lower the f number, the f-stop, and the lower the number, the bigger the aperture, which will allow more light in. So therefore I'll need to do that. But you'll notice with the camera I'm using in this later on in this video, the maximum aperture it can go to is 5.6. You can get lenses go f4, which is a bigger one, f2.8, and even lower, which means bigger aperture, which means more light in, and then the camera can then work out a faster shutter speed. But on this particular lens, I can't do that. So what I need to do is I need to increase my ISO, the sensitivity. So therefore, that'll give me a faster shutter speed. So that's all controlled in the mode of AV. Now when we go to the mode of TV or S on some cameras, you're then actually controlling now the shutter speed, and the camera is going to control the aperture. So I've now set the camera, because I'm in TV or S, I've now set that at 1,000th of a second, and I'm at 400 ISO. So I press the shutter button down halfway and it'll come up with f5.6 or f8 or even f7.1 or f11. It'll come up with an f-stop. So now the camera is controlling the f-stop. You're controlling the shutter speed. So we can control two of the three on the exposure triangle, because what we're doing is we're allowing the camera to help us to get that shot. Nothing wrong with that at all. You'll notice later on in this video, when I'm actually putting this into practice, I'm looking at the camera, I'm telling you that I need to be set out at 5.6, ISO 400, but then I have to press the shutter button halfway down to be able to see what the camera is getting on the shutter speed. And that's why I'll turn around and I'll say to you, well, I'm getting a 60th of a second, or I'm getting 250th of a second. And that's why, because the camera's controlling, when I'm in AV or A, the camera is controlling the shutter speed. I'm controlling the aperture, which is f5.6 in this case. Well, hopefully that's starting to make a little bit of sense to you. I'm going to give you some sample settings now for you to try. So your camera mode, that needs to be in AV or A on some cameras. That's aperture priority. So you're going to set the aperture, and I want you to set that at f5.6. The ISO, I need you to set that at 400, and because you're in AV, your camera will decide the shutter speed. So they are a starting point. So as you know, if you haven't got a shutter speed higher than 500, let's give a setting of higher than 500, you need to alter the ISO. So good luck with that, and plenty of practice, and you'll see how well that'll come out. Okay, what I'm going to do now is actually put into practice what we've talked about with the exposure triangle. You'll notice today I've bought my tripod. I've bought it for this project so I can show you about the exposure triangle. At the moment I'm on 400 ISO on f5.6, and the shutter speed is 1,000th of a second. That's 1/1000. Now that would be fabulous for any wildlife that's running around, that's in the trees. That's a fantastic setting, so you're going to have plenty of light, great exposure, no problem at all. Now if I move around again into the woods in a different location, the sun is behind me up here, let's see what settings we've got then. Okay, well now I'm facing into the woods, the sun's behind me and it's illuminating the ground but not actually into the woods. So at the moment, again 400 ISO, f5.6, I've got a 60th of a second, which is too slow for anything with wildlife. So first thing I'm going to do, because I can't lower the f-stop and get a bigger aperture, because that's the maximum this lens can do, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go with the ISO, and I'm going to put that up to, let's say 1000. Now I've got 200th of a second. Now again, a perched bird, that'll be fine, no problem. But if I go up to 1600, that's giving me 320th of a second, which for a perched bird or for animal stationary, again, that is perfect, so no problem at all. It's all about stops, ISO stops, it's all about the f-stop, and it's all about taking the shutter speed to the speed we need to capture the animal. My name's Mark Blake. I hope you've found this video useful, and I hope you've learnt plenty to go out and take some fantastic wildlife shots. If you have enjoyed it, please hit the like button and maybe consider subscribing. You take care and be safe. Bye now.